Alrighty, so let's talk some Pavlov. Pavlov's an interesting character, and a good way of kind of kicking off this whole chapter. So I'm actually going to get to Pavlov, but before I get there, I got to kind of ease you into the area. And one of the things you'll find about this chapter is there's a whole lot of new terminology specific to learning theory, and so we got to start kind of introducing you to this terminology and getting you comfortable with it. So let's jump in. So first of all, we're going to be talking a lot about stimuli and responses. I'll really kind of in a subsequent lecture, just before the John Watson one, I'll really highlight why science has gotten restricted the way it has. But for now, let's just sort of take it from me, and I'll explain to you in a moment why it's so much about stimuli and responses. But this is what we're really going to look at, is how, like, if we go back for a moment to that thing I said to you when we were doing the genetics timeline, and I said, okay, Darwin was worried about how life became so variable. Well, learning theorists are interested in how human behavior becomes so complex, rich, and variable as we age. Where do we get all of these crazy responses, all these different behaviors we emit? Where did they come from? How did they come to be? And so often behavior in a learning world is seen as a response that occurs in the context of some stimulus. And we often think of the stimulus as provoking the behavior. And so it's all about stimuli and the responses they become associated with. So let's start out with the basics, which are the UCS and the UCR, the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. Let me get you there. Okay. The idea is we didn't have to learn every behavior we have. That we come, in fact, hardwired with some behaviors. We are born with some, reflexive sort of responses to the world. Here are some examples. When, even a newborn, when you put some milk in a newborn baby's mouth, their digestive process will be initiated. You'll see their salivation will increase, and if you could look at their intestines and stuff, if you could look at their body, you would see that the stomach becomes stimulated, the intestines become stimulated, etc. The whole digestive system sort of comes to life when you put a little food in a baby's mouth. You'll see this will become kind of relevant when we get to Pavlov. Other examples, if there's a projectile that's coming at your face, something's coming at you, we have this natural habit of closing our eyes, usually raising our hands if we have time, and often, ducking our heads or whatever, and holding our breath. And that's just a natural. Something comes at us and we just do that. And we didn't have to learn to do that. It's not like we got pegged in the face a bunch of times by things before we figured out, oh, we better, protect ourselves. We're born knowing how to protect ourselves. When we hear a creepy noise or otherwise sense some potential danger, our sympathetic nervous system kicks in. At least a little, as I say. It's not necessarily that you run screaming, but you could be laying in bed and you hear some noise and you're a little more awake and you're a little more alert and you're kind of listening to what's going on over there. That's your sympathetic nervous system, potential danger, right? And that happens automatically. So in each of these cases, notice that there's actually two things: a stimulus, food, and a response or a behavior, the digestive process kicking in. Stimulus, a projectile coming towards our face. Response, close our eyes, duck our heads, raise our hands. So in this case, there's sort of what we might call a response complex. There's a set of responses that we might do in response to that stimulus. Creepy noise, stimulus, sympathetic nervous system kicks in, response. Okay, now we call these ones that we have from birth, the ones we did not have to learn, an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. So first of all, let's just pull this apart a little bit. Unconditioned, conditioned. Well, learning theorists, when they put an animal through a learning experience, they call it conditioning the animal. It's a strange word. It's not like conditioning your hair. Well, maybe it is. Not really. And so the word conditioned in this chapter, you can almost substitute the word learned. So an unlearned stimulus and an unlearned response. You didn't have to learn this one. You had it already. So it's unlearned, which is a funny way of saying it. But yeah, you didn't have to learn it. It was already there. Now, the other thing I really want you to realize is these terms are going to come in pairs. And nobody ever stresses this in a textbook, but once I thought about it this way, it was so much easier for me. It's like these words are the words husband and wife. So even if someone's talking about a husband, you know there's a wife that goes along with that husband, right? It's a term that's used to denote one member of a pair. And there's always an implied pair. So we can take an example like this one. The food in our mouths produces, kicks in our digestive system. And we can say in that example, the food we'll be calling an unconditioned stimulus. And the digestive process is the unconditioned response. But notice that food is the unconditioned stimulus just with respect to digestive. That is, it kicks in the digestive process and you don't have to learn that. So that pair, the fact that food kicks in the digestive process, is an unconditioned stimulus giving rise to an unconditioned response. An unlearned stimulus giving rise to an unlearned response. You didn't have to learn that. That just happens. But it's that pair that we're really thinking about. We just sometimes talk about them individually as an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Let's let that one settle for a bit. We'll build on it as we go. And in fact, that'll be a big part of the story, how new behaviors can get built on ones that we were born with, okay? But before we get there, we're going to talk about how these things we're born with can actually disappear in a way, weakening the stimulus response mapping. We've actually talked about an example of this. I'll come back to it in a second, but let's just walk through this. So this is something we call habituation. If there's a, let's say, so here I say some novel stimulus. So the example we're talking about here is like the creepy sound one. So imagine you're living in a new place and you're staying in this bedroom where you don't usually stay. And so there are odd sounds that you're not used to. And it's probably just the heating system, or it's the way the floorboards creak, or it's funny noises the doors make in that house, whatever it may be. But if you're not used to them, then when you're in that environment, you hear some sound and it tends to produce this startle response, or this sympathetic nervous system. It gets you a little bit anxious, right? And again, this is an unconditioned stimulus, creepy noise, giving rise to an unconditioned response, sort of that alertingness, that alerting and a wakefulness and, creepy kind of response. If you stay in that bedroom night after night after night, what you will find is those weird, creepy sounds stop creeping you out. In fact, they disappear completely if this happens, okay? And what is this? Let me just be a little bit more clear about what this is. So habituation. The idea would be this. You hear that creepy noise, you get a little alert, you wait for something bad to happen. Nothing bad happens. Eventually you go to sleep. A little while later, creepy noise, you're waiting for something bad to happen, Nothing happens. After a while, when you get enough creepy noises and there's never anything bad happen, you habituate to it. You just stop being woke up to. Even though this was a pre-wired kind of response, and it does happen automatically when you first hear those creepy noises, when you have more experience with those creepy noises and you realize that they're not predicting anything good or bad, you stop hearing them. They just kind of disappear. And so if a stimulus occurs repeatedly without any positive or negative consequence, the startle response stops occurring. What this tells you, by the way, is your brain is interested in stimuli that have predictive value, that tell it something about the future or what might happen. And if a stimulus doesn't tell you anything, you stop attending to it. It becomes irrelevant. And that's a process called habituation. So yes, creepy noises you no longer hear. This is just an example. I used to live at a place that was close to an airport, and there were airplanes that would fly overhead. The first few times we heard this, it was like, oh my God, a plane's going to crash on our house. Goes over, nothing crashes, everything's okay. Even though it's a crazy loud sound, after a while, I wouldn't respond to them at all. I wouldn't even hear them. In fact, I would be on the phone talking to my friends, and I developed this habit that I didn't even understand, that when the planes were over, it was so loud, you couldn't speak on the phone. So I would just shut up for a second, plane going over, and then I would continue talking where I left off. And quite often, the person on the other end of the phone would be like, "What the heck just happened there?" And I'd be like, "What?" "Well, there's some loud noise. What the heck just happened?" I'm like, "The what?" "Oh, I don't know, maybe a plane went over? Did you hear a plane?" But I hadn't even heard it. I just automatically stopped talking, let it go over, blah, 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 continue on. That's habituation. And what about the mirror effect? Remember I told you that some animals, you put a mirror up in the cage, they first react like it's a member of their own species. So they might do various things to the mirror, friendly or unfriendly or otherwise. But then after a while, a lot of animals, well, we now know the word, they habituate to the reflection. That reflection doesn't suggest anything good's going to happen or anything bad's going to happen. It tells them nothing of value to them, and they stop looking. The first time I heard dogs didn't pass the mirror test, I was annoyed, and I went home and tried with my dog. Look, you're in the mirror. And the dogs are like, they often won't even look at themselves in the mirror. They don't even seem to compute it in a certain way. And so it's kind of interesting, but that's habituation. Okay, so this is the first way in which these stimulus response mappings can be changed. You can start with something that's there from birth, but then within a given situation, you learn not to let that stimulus, the creepy noise, wake you up. Okay, you just stop responding to it, and that's called habituation. I think the textbook kind of missed habituation, but I always see it as an important starting part. Okay. Then we come into Pavlov, and the book does a pretty good job describing Pavlov, so I'm not going to do a lot of detail here, but I will walk you through the basic process because it's core to psychology. It's really important that you understand this, and so I want to walk you through it too, and just give you that sort of second exposure to go along with the textbook exposure. So I also like to tell you a little bit of the story of Pavlov because it's an interesting story. Pavlov was a physiologist. He's not a psychologist for sure. He was studying the digestive system. In fact, he'd won awards for his studies of the digestive system. He came to suddenly be this very powerful psychologist because of something he formalized and called classical conditioning. And he's really become very, very influential. And his research kicked off this whole area we're going to call behaviorism, the area this whole chapter is about. What I want you to know about Pavlov, first of all, is what I call the pivot, because I think this is so interesting. So first of all, you have to understand Pavlov's experiments a little bit and his original idea. So this isn't all always so nice for me to describe, being a dog lover, but I will. He did a lot of experiments with dogs, and what he would do is surgery where he could put a little tube up through their sort of under their jaw and into their mouth. And what that tube would do is collect saliva. And it would actually it would allow him to measure how much saliva is in the mouth. Now, it turns out the amount of saliva in one's mouth is a very good indicator of how active the digestive system is. Remember, food activates the digestive system. That's what Pavlov was originally studying. He was curious whether different foods might stimulate the digestive system in different ways. And so he was just setting up a study where he was going to give these dogs a variety of different foods on different days and measure their digestive response. However, he ran into this nuisance, and he was smart enough to realize the nuisance was cooler than what he was originally studying. Okay, and this was the nuisance. The idea he had, or what he thought would happen, is okay, the dog would just be sitting there, digestive process would not be engaged. We would give it some food, and once the food hit the mouth, then we would see the digestive process engage, and we could see, how strongly it engaged. Cool. Here's the problem. After just a couple of days of going through the procedure, as soon as the dog sensed that food was being prepared, it started salivating. The digestive process kicked in. It started producing saliva. And so there they are, they want to put the food in the mouth and see the reaction. But as they're just preparing the food, the dog's already reacting. And Pavlov's like, no, don't react yet. We want to see what the food does. And you're already reacting before I even give you the food. So at one level, you could imagine some scientists going, how am I going to do my science if this stupid dog starts drooling before I even give it the food? But Pavlov did the pivot. And the pivot was, wow, why are they doing that? How did they learn to do that? How do they know we're going to give them food? How does their digestive system know we're going to give them food? That's fascinating. Maybe I'll study that. And so this is, what in small business we call a pivot. You have a product, you're going after a certain market, it's not working, but you see some other opportunity and you pivot, you go that way. That's what Pavlov did scientifically. And I suggest it to you because maybe some of you guys will be in situations in your life down the road where you'll be really trying to force some idea somehow, and it's not working because something's coming up. Every now and then pay attention to that something that's coming up, because sometimes it's more powerful than your original thing, and be ready to pivot, because you could become a famous psychologist. No, maybe not that, but all right. So Pavlov, was fascinated by this reaction, and what he really did then that kind of made him so well known and really set the stage for behaviorism is he got very formal and specific about studying this. And this is going to be a hallmark of behaviorism from here on. So let me just walk you through and give you some terminology as we go. And so here would be Pavlov demonstrating, what he's done to people. He'd say, okay, at the beginning of the experiment, I could ring this bell. And when I ring the bell near the dog, it doesn't salivate. It probably alerts to the bell, right? That's a UCS UCR, right? If it heard a bell, it would probably attend to it, look at it, but it won't drool. This is why I say, by the way, you always got to think of UCSs and UCRs as pairs, right? Because you can think of a bell with a different response alerting, and that is a UCS UCR. But as far as at the beginning of the experiment, ring a bell and the dog drools, no. With that pair, neither of them are UCS or UCRs at this point. They're just unconnected. Okay. Now there is a UCS UCR that we know of. I've told you about it before. You put food in the dog's mouth and it salivates. Okay? This doesn't have to learn to do this. Knows this from birth. That's what makes it unconditioned. It didn't have to learn. So we have this unconditioned stimulus, food, producing an unconditioned response of a whole bunch of drool. And I say a whole bunch of drool because I want to actually highlight something for you that's a potential confusion, but I'll try to clarify it. So he drools a lot when he gets this food. Okay, great. Now, let's teach the dog. Let's go through some conditioning trials, is what we call it. And here's what a conditioning trial looks like. Trial after trial, we do the following. We ring a bell, then we give the dog food, and of course he drools, because he drools when he gets food, right? And we ring a bell, give him food, he drools. Ring a bell, give him food, he drools. Ring a bell, give him food, he drools. We do this over and over again. You don't have to do it too many times with dogs, by the way, because they're really freaking smart. But you do this a number of times, and then voila. At the end of the experiment, you do the following. You ring a bell, no food, just ring a bell, and what you see is if you just ring a bell, the dog starts drooling. Remember at the beginning of the experiment, we rang a bell, the dog didn't drool. Why is they drooling now? Because the bell predicted the occurrence of food. Let's go back. The bell was presented reliably just before the food. And it seems like, just like I told you, the brain is looking for things with predictive value. And this is predicting food is going to arrive. And so after enough of these trials, the dog learns that the bell predicts food. He didn't know this at the beginning. In fact, it wasn't true at the beginning, right? At the very beginning, the bell didn't predict anything, so he didn't drool. But after a bunch of these trials, now when he gets the bell, he thinks food's coming, and he's already drooling. This is, of course, the thing that messed with Pavlov in the first place, right? that it wasn't a bell, it was just the preparing of the food or the person going near the fridge to get the food or whatever. But he'd now formalized it in this procedure. Now that we've created this connection between the bell and drooling, This is the conditioned stimulus response pair. We've conditioned this. This was not the case at the beginning of the experiment. What we've done is we've added a new behavior to this dog's repertoire. It used to have just the things it was born with, but now it's learning that bell predicts something. And so now I'm going to respond to the bell too. And so his behavior is becoming more complicated, right? It's sort of chaining in that way. Now, I want you to realize something. You'd say, well, you're saying this is a conditioned stimulus and this is a conditioned response, but I thought his drooling was an unconditioned response. It is to food. When he drools in response to food, or even better yet here, this is an unconditioned response to food. This is why I say you got to think of them as pairs. But with respect to the bell, this is a conditioned response. It's sort of the same response. It's drooling. It's not actually the same response. If you look here, what do I have? 4 drops of drool and a double puddle. Here's the real one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 drops of pool and a 3-ring puddle. My point here is the conditioned response tends to be a little less intense. It's similar in style to the unconditioned response to food. Because he's expecting food. So he's almost starting. He's preparing that response. He's engaging in that response in preparation. But it's not as strong as when the food is in his mouth. And so we do think of the CR as distinct from the UCR. Similar in form, but usually less intense in terms of the actual power of the behavior. So let's just kind of grow. This is the central part you have to get to then build on with some of the other things the textbook tells you about. But the first part is, hey, our brain, it's always looking to predict the future. In fact, one of the reasons COVID was so tough on us is it sort of in a swoop took the carpet out from under our brain, and our brain didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow anymore. And that makes us feel anxious. Our brain likes to be able to predict and expect things and prepare for things. And so it's constantly looking for things that give it clues about what's going to happen in the future. And that's really what Pavlov's experiment is all about. So in order for this to work, the UCS must reliably follow the CS. So this new stimulus that it's going to learn about has to predict something. And so you need the unconditioned stimulus to occur not long after the conditioned one, because that's what it's predicting. It's predicting the unconditioned is about to happen, right? I hope you're getting okay with this jargon, because it is, you got to wrap your head around it. If you don't, so there's a number of ways you can weaken the learning. For example, you could present the unconditioned stimulus quite a while after the conditioned stimulus. The longer it takes, then the less predictive this conditioned stimulus is. Or you could even make it sometimes there's a UCS afterwards, sometimes they're not. If you do anything to weaken the connection, the predictability of the occurrence of a UCS because you saw a CS, then you get less learning. Okay, it's fine. Now, here's a kind of interesting thing. 2 interesting things. So what happens if you do this to a dog? You give a bunch of conditioning trials, you now ring the bell and it drools, and then you do the following thing. You ring the bell and don't give him food, and then ring the bell and don't give him food, and then ring the bell and don't give him food, and ring the bell and don't give him food. Eventually he'll stop drooling to the bell, and we call that extinction. So eventually he'll realize, okay, the bell is not predicting the food anymore, so I guess it's not worth drooling to anymore, and it stops. However, the learning that it achieved seems still to be there, because what we will see is that this learning that happened can reactivate really quickly. A process called spontaneous recovery. There's 2 ways that happens. One is, let's go through the whole process. So we have bell, food. So it learns bell and it starts drooling because it's getting food. And then we do a whole bunch of bell, no food, bell, no food, bell, no food, bell, no food, and we reach extinction. But then if we just do 1 bell, food, then the next trial, you give it a bell and it's drooling again, just like at the end of learning. So it's kind of like the dog is saying, oh, we're back to that game, are we? Okay, now the bell predicts the food and it's back there. In fact, even if you just Stop the learning trials for a while. Like let's say you did a bunch of extinction trials. Bell, no food. Bell, no food. Bell, no food. And then you give the dog a break for a couple of weeks. And then you bring him back and you say, Bell, he'll drool. Just in case that old thing he learned is still active. And so either of these things we call spontaneous recovery. And you can suddenly see that learned behavior real, back in spades. Now, why is this important? We've been very Pavlov based. We've been very, dogs and food and drool. But a lot of the things you're going to learn about in this chapter are now part of a lot of the therapies that we use, including a lot of this stuff on conditioning. Have you heard of cognitive behavior therapy? That second word, behavior. That says we're going to take what we learned from cognitive psychology, but we're going to combine it with what we learned from behaviorism, which is what we're talking about right now. And we're going to use that as a therapy. So a lot of these ideas become part of therapy. So for example, let's say somebody has learned to become anxious of an elevator. And the claim is this is something people can learn just like this. So maybe because they got trapped in an elevator a couple times, they get trapped in an elevator, it's horrible, and that caused all this uncomfortable kind of feeling. What predicted them getting trapped in an elevator? Well, they stepped into an elevator and then all that happened. And so they can start to learn that stepping into an elevator can predict a bunch of negative stuff. And so they can start to feel all that anxiety at the thought of stepping into an elevator. And they can become they can become phobic of elevators, and they're walking upstairs all the time because of that. So they've got what's called a conditioned fear response that's built. We'll learn more about those soon from Watson. You could give them therapy, which would be extinction therapy. You could say, no, look, you're going to go into that elevator. Let's go into that elevator. Let's take a ride. We'll take a ride. Nothing bad happens. See? Let's do it again. Let's go in an elevator. Take a ride. Nothing bad happens. See? Let's go in an elevator. Take a ride. Nothing bad happens. See? So you can do this over and over and try to produce extinction. So they feel like, okay, I can step into an elevator and not feel all that anxiety. The problem is, if they go for a while without being in an elevator, or God forbid they're in an elevator and something kind of goes wrong for a moment, boom, they're right back to their original state. All that therapy is wiped out, gone. Spontaneous recovery of the conditioned response. That's why these things are kind of cool and interesting and neat. Okay, there's one other thing I want to leave you with the classical conditioning. I'm going to chime in. I'm going to give you a cool little video I shot of my dog and get you to think about it a little bit because it's funny. But what I want to leave you with here is this. People go through the classical conditioning thing and they say, oh, okay, I get it. This learning theory stuff is easy. It all makes sense. Cool. And then we do the next part of it, which is called operant conditioning. And that all kind of makes sense. But then they get confused about, well, wait a minute, how's classical different from operant? What's operant conditioning? So I want to preempt some of that, and I'll try to be clear with you at the end. But what I want to do is make you, very aware here that what we're talking about here is what we could call learning via association. I'll compare that to learning via consequences, which is what operant conditioning. Operant conditioning will focus on the consequences of behaving a certain way and how they change us. This has nothing to do with consequences. This has everything to do with some stimulus being associated with a stimulus that has a response. And if you get associated to something that already has a response, then you can get that response attached to you as well, right? That response can kind of work its way back a little bit. And so, yeah, it's learning by association. The dog is learning that the bell is associated with food, that it predicts food. And so it responds to the bell in the sort of same way that it responds to food. So it's all about the association and the fact of one stimulus predicting another. Keep that in mind for now. And then when we do the operant stuff, I'll come back to this point and compare the two of them so that hopefully you have a good way of separating the two in your mind. All right, onward from here. I've got a little video, got a little video down there for you to watch that's funny, that'll hopefully help you understand what you just heard a little better. And a little below that, I have a video of my dog and a little ritual my dog and I do, and I have a couple of questions for you about that just to see what you're thinking with all this stuff. All right, see you there. Bye-bye.